Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, I am going to profile one of my favorite decks of all time. I am going to profile the zombie variants utilizing Card of Safe Return from the September 2007 format. This deck was unfortunately short-lived because by the end of the format, we saw a massive change in the card pool. We saw cards like Light and Darkness Dragon be released, cards eventually like Dark Arm Dragon, and then all of the Phantom Darkness cards like Allure of Darkness, which means that this deck only really shined for a few months, but in that few-month window of time, this was by far one of the most enjoyable and explosive decks that you could run. And in addition to that, it utilized cards that had been really powerful, had maybe in some cases warranted bannings previously, but had never really shined. Cards like Card of Safe Return, which would eventually be banned, but at this point in US history was actually at 3, and this zombie deck for the first time really utilized that strategy. In previous iterations of decks, looking back at the early 2000s, people ran things like Mana Core of Darkness loops for Exodia combos, but this was really the first control variant that utilized Card of Safe Return, and Card of Safe Return is personally one of my favorite cards, so seeing a deck that utilized it in this fashion was really exciting. I also think, as the case with all of the videos, it's important to put things into context. This is the beginning of the 2007 September format. In this series of videos with both deck profiles and matches, we've profiled the summer of 2007. We looked at Machine Beatdown. I posted videos playing Machine Beatdown variants. We looked at the Khorne Monarch deck that won the 2007 US Nationals. We looked at other variants of decks from 2007, like the infamous T-Hero deck. Well, at the end of that format, going into the September format of 2007, there was a significant change on the ban list. Cards like Metamorphosis were banned, totally taking away a strategy from those T-Hero variants. And that card's now actually been permanently banned. We saw other limitations that really hit those strategies. Card Trooper went from 3 to 1. No more Troop Dupe. Trap Dust Shoot went from 3 to 1. No longer were virtually every deck by the end of the 2007 summer format able to run triple Trap Dust Shoot. Other major restrictions and limitations. Cards like Confiscation and Ring of Destruction, which were pivotal components of decks during the summer, were banned. So when the 2007 September format rolled around, with the release of Tactical Evolution, we had this influx of new cards, particularly Zombie Master and Illblood, and this massive ban list that totally shook everything up. Team Super Friends, a team combining aspects of Team Overdose, and the Super Friends team, like Matt Petal, Lazaro Bolito, and Dale Bolito, built the zombie deck that I'm about to profile. I remember back in those days hearing about a lot of success that they were having at some of the events in Canada, some of the regionals, and then eventually the deck that I'm going to profile today is a deck that you would have seen at the Shonen Jump Championship in Washington, D.C. at the very beginning of the 2007 format. Unfortunately, none of the individuals running zombie variants ended up winning the event. Jonathan Labounty, a player with Perfect Circle, ultimately ended up winning the event with the deck that we'll probably profile. But there were many players in the top cut that ran this type of zombie deck, and then in subsequent events, we saw the deck continue to be successful and then eventually win a YCS, or Shonen Jump at the time. So today we're going to profile the zombie variant that utilized Card of Safe Return, a short-lived but nevertheless very exciting deck from Yu-Gi-Oh's history. All right, we'll start the deck profile with 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where decks basically all ran 3 copies of Cyber Dragon. I actually think this zombie deck had so much field presence you didn't really need 3 copies of Cyber Dragon, but we're going to profile what Team Super Friends ran. If you go back and look at the Shonen Jump in Washington, you'll actually see that Matt Petal ran 2 of these, another member of Super Friends. He only ran 2, while other members of his team ran 3, so I will say that I guess there was some debate within Super Friends as to whether or not 2 versus 3 was correct. I think in retrospect, I would have cut that card down at least a little bit. But nevertheless, we'll continue on with the zombie package. There are quite a few different zombies in this deck, as you'll anticipate. 3 copies of Pyramid Turtle, the best zombie recruiter there is. 3 of the newly released Zombie Master. This card was brand new from Tactical Evolution, the most recent set in September 2007. This card combos with virtually all of the deck. Honestly, it was this card's release that almost single-handedly built this deck, in combination with Illblood, but I'll talk about Illblood in just a moment. Some of the other zombies, we had 2 copies of Ryokoki. Now, honestly, this card's effect wasn't overwhelmingly useful. There were some Spellcaster and Warrior monsters, but the fact that you could special summon it off Pyramid Turtle was really the big part of running this card. It made it so that your normal summon of a Pyramid Turtle could turn into a 2400 monster, and when you're playing against opponents who, for example, might leave a Cyber Dragon in attack mode, they might think well, maybe they're going to go get something like Vampire Lord, thinking back to what Yu-Gi-Oh may have been like 3 or 4 years prior, but nope, we're going into Ryokoki, the biggest monster that you can get off of a Pyramid Turtle. At that point, we had 1 copy of Spirit Reaper. Spirit Reaper is actually really useful in this deck because the deck ran Creature Swap, and I'll talk about the reason why in a little bit. It's not the traditional way of swapping a turtle, crashing it, and attacking with Reaper. Like, yeah, you could do that, but there are other things that Reaper allowed you to do. From that point, in terms of other zombies, the last one was 1 copy for me of Illblood. I only liked 1 copy of Illblood. If you go back and look at the top cut, players either ran 2 or 3 copies. To me, I felt like this deck, when you're running Koki and then to an extent Cyber Dragon, you sometimes produced hands where you couldn't do anything, and I think Illblood was one of those cards that I think really warranted only 1 single spot. You wanted to be able to search it once off Pyramid Turtle, but past that, drawing this card was miserable. What this card basically allowed you to do is, if you had yet to use your normal summon, which happened a lot in this deck because with 3 turtles and a Reaper, and then even a giant rat, some variants ran 2 giant rats. I have 1 here, but some variants did run 2. It's not necessarily a zombie, but it gets into Pyramid Turtle, so it essentially is the 4th copy of Pyramid Turtle. In a deck with this many recruiters and then cards like Reaper, some of the games ended up stalling out. And what that would allow you to do is crash your Pyramid Turtle to search out your Illblood. And because you had yet to use your normal summon, you could then, on that turn, Gemini summon the Illblood and then special summon a zombie from your graveyard, which oftentimes meant drawing a card if you had card a safe return on the board. It was essentially a way of reviving a zombie from the graveyard without having to rely on Zombie Master and having a monster in hand to pitch. So it was just another tool that this deck had. This card was really expensive at the time, so it's not impossible that players that elected only to run 1 did so because they didn't want to fork over the, let's say, $150 price tag that Illblood was, which was, at the time, really, really expensive. Those of you that play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Or even Yu-Gi-Oh!, let's say during Dark Arm Return format, you might be thinking, really, $150 Secret Rare when the rest of the other cards in the deck are pretty cheap? What's the big deal? But at that time, $150 Secret Rare was definitely a massive price tag and a reason not to play this deck. And then, of course, like I mentioned, a single copy of Giant Rat. Giant Rat could actually technically still search you the single copy of Card Trooper. As I mentioned, this card was limited to 1 at the beginning of this format. Remember, the format prior was Troop Dupe with 3 copies. Some other utility monsters, we had a copy of Sangan. Sangan searched out the recruiters. It also searched out some of your other utility cards like Snipe Hunter and Morphing Jar. And then the other utility monster was the newly unbanned Breaker. I think a lot of players elected to run Breaker because it was recently unbanned. It was banned during the summer format. I don't know how much of a role it actually played in this deck. It technically could destroy your opponent's card to save returns, which were useful, certainly, but it did take up a normal summon when this deck was very normal summon centric. So if you were to go back and sort of perfect this deck, you might cut some of the cards like Breaker, but I think by and large it had a reasonable spot. Other things to talk about with some of these utility creatures, Morphing Jar is really important because this deck ran Creature Swap, and being able to swap a Morphing Jar and immediately attack into it was a huge advantage, both in this format and really any format where you could do that. In addition, even if you don't pull off the Creature Swap combo, having cards like Illblood and Koki, even some dead Cyber Dragons, make it so that getting a fresh hand off Morphing Jar can be really useful. Snipe Hunter was obviously a really powerful card. This was at a period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where a lot of decks ran it. That would persist basically through the Dark Arm Return format and then a little bit into Teledad, and then it kind of lost popularity at that point. But at this point in time, with a deck that has a lot of monsters like Koki and Illblood, like I mentioned, that you don't want in your hand, it wasn't a bad idea to ditch them. Plus, if you had one of those hands where you had Snipe Hunter and a lot of zombies, you could ditch the zombies and then revive them with 8 or 9 different ways that you can do that with spell cards or trap cards. So it had a decent role in the deck. And then Trooper wasn't that bad. It was a giant rat target. This is at a period of time where we just came off of Troop Dupe format, so I think players were biased to the power of even a single card Trooper after having played against it so much during the summer. And it did fuel your graveyard. Not the way that more modern zombie decks did with Mizuki and Plague Spreader. Those cards were not yet released. But nevertheless, this deck's still running Book of Life, so it's not a bad idea to mill 3 and possibly hit some zombie monsters. Next, we'll go into the spells. I think the spells here are awesome. We have 3 copies of Card of Safe Return. This is really what made the deck. At this point in time, this card was at 3. It would eventually be limited to 2 and then eventually banned, but at this point in time, it was at 3. And with this deck, drawing Card of Safe Return was incredible because you had, of course, 3 copies of Book of Life to combo with the Zombie Master and Illblood from the monster lineup. You also had, I'll jump around a little bit here, you also had a copy of Premature Burial, which is at this point still unbanned. So you had 4 recursion spells to go along with the 4 recursion monsters. Other good spell cards, this deck did a great job utilizing Creature Swap. It did a great job utilizing Creature Swap for two reasons. The most obvious reason was the fact that, yes, your deck has 4 or 5 recruiters if you wanted to run double rat. So this was one of the most obvious ways that Creature Swap is really powerful. The second way it was really powerful is if you could get off Morphing Jar. The third way, though, the way that actually resulted in a lot of wins, was when you took your own Spirit Reaper and shifted it to attack mode and then used Creature Swap and gave your opponent the Spirit Reaper. A lot of the decks, particularly the mirror matches at this point, produced really grindy, long games, and this deck did a really fantastic job spamming monsters on the board. You know, you could do things like Zombie Master, Revive Zombie Master, Revive Zombie Master. So you could very quickly establish a big board out of almost nowhere. And then at the end of that, you could Creature Swap your opponent a Spirit Reaper and attack all of your monsters into the attack position Reaper and kill them out of nowhere, even if your opponent thinks they're well defended with cards like maybe Defense Position Gravekeeper Spies. So the Creature Swap actually had several uses in this deck. Triggering recruiters, shifting Morphing Jar to the opponent, and then attacking through Spirit Reaper. This deck elected to run 2 copies of Nobleman of Crossout. There were a reasonable amount of face-down monsters at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. When I talk about some of the decks, when we get into side deck options, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then just some borderline staples at this time. Single MST and Heavy Storm, they were both limited to 1. Obviously did a good job against opposing zombie decks, and then they're just generally good cards. Brain Control was a new limitation during Troop Dupe, as we saw from really several of the most recent videos. This card was at 3 during the summer format. It was now limited to 1. And then the last card that's a little bit unique is Lightning Vortex. This deck can really build up a good hand presence with the cards like Card of Safe Return. And if you're running in the mirror match and your opponent's stalling out with Defense Position Turtles and some of the other cards in this deck, you could Vortex them out of nowhere and then OTK them or establish your own field presence. Or honestly, even if you had field presence, just shift everything to attack mode and push. So Lightning Vortex was a really useful card. Sometimes it was hard to come back when your opponent built up a big board with this deck, so this was one of the best ways of doing it. The Trop lineup was pretty simple. We have 2 copies of Dust Tornado. With cards like Card of Safe Return, Creature Swap, Zombie Master, this whole strategy really is very swingy, and what I mean by that is you could have an empty board, maybe just with a set Dust Tornado, and then on your turn out of nowhere, you could summon 1 Zombie Master and threaten a board of 3 or 4 monsters, depending on how many you had in the graveyard. And then with cards like Creature Swap, you could totally take control of the game by swapping your opponent a turtle or a rat, and then that might ultimately lead you into a Zombie Master in a full board. So what this deck often tried to do was pinpoint one specific turn where it could just take advantage of the game. Cards like Dust Tornado did a really good job whittling away your opponent's back rows during the end phase, just like MST, and then making that one big push that ultimately won you the game. It also did a good job in the mirror match against, of course, Card of Safe Return. From that point, we had a Call of the Haunted, a recursion trap card, allowing us to, of course, bring back monsters from the graveyard, but also draw of Card of Safe Return. Some mass destruction cards of Mirror Force and Torrential. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where these cards were still basically staples. I think in this deck, it was actually probably correct to run them, particularly if you were going to run into mirror matches and had a difficult time clearing the field. And then the last card's a little bit interesting. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where people played cards like Sakuratsu Armor and Widespread Ruin still. This deck elected to run Widespread Ruin. The primary reason was the mirror match with Illblood. So before Illblood's release, the only reason you'd really run Widespread Ruin was because it did not target and it played around Cyber Phoenix, unlike Sakuratsu Armor. In this current format, though, if you were playing against a zombie deck and they summoned Illblood, and let's say they had a bunch of zombies on the field, let's say they had a couple zombies like this, when your opponent attacked, let's say, with a Pyramid Turtle, and you had a Sakuratsu Armor face down, yes, you could Sakuratsu Armor the Pyramid Turtle, that's great. But let's say this Illblood had been on the field for a few turns and was incrementally adding cards to the board through its effect. If your opponent attacked with a Pyramid Turtle, though, and you responded with Widespread Ruin destroys the monster with the highest attack power. In this case, it would be Illblood. When Illblood is sent to the graveyard, it destroys all of the monsters that it special summoned, so it actually could act almost as a pseudo Mirror Force under the circumstances of your opponent being able to build up a board with Illblood. Seems like a little bit of a niche situation, I totally concede that. But let's say you really wanted a 6th trap that could help respond to attacks. The difference between Sakuratsu Armor and Widespread Ruin is pretty minimal anyway. You almost always want to just kill the biggest monster. And this situation, if you were expecting a lot of mirror matches, might come up. And then certainly the decision to one Widespread Ruin could obviously be game-breaking. Before we get into the side deck, I want to talk about one other card. If you look at the SJC Washington deck list, you'll notice that Philly Luna ran a copy of Crush card. I think that is correct. Now, this deck technically only has a Sangan and a Spear Reaper, but this deck could basically access Spear Reaper whenever it wanted, and I think a card like Crush card was so powerful that it warranted the inclusion even if you only had a couple targets. So if you could have afforded Crush card, I think it should be included in the deck. I wouldn't add it to the deck if I was going to go back and play this format. I typically have that standard where if it's a prize card, and it's a prize card that may have been $2,000, $3,000, let's assume that you would not have had access to it, and therefore let's not include it if we're going to go back and play these old formats. But if I were to go back and had access to it, I almost definitely would have played it. Before we get into the side deck, as we always do, I want to talk about some of the decks at the time, and I have a pretty big pile today because at the beginning of the 2007 format, and then honestly this persisted quite a bit, there was just a lot of viable decks. So the first big deck at the time that I would have worried about was the Comic Odyssey Burn deck. It was basically a skill drain stall deck with cards like Wave Motion Cannon and then monsters that were unaffected by skill drain like Dark Mimic level 3 and Card Trooper. That was a little bit of a beatdown burn deck that had stall elements that often could totally smokescreen side into something like Monarchs, which made it really difficult to play against because you could come at it in game one, lose because it's a burn deck where you have minimal cards to destroy back rows. Then you side in cards like Decree, and next thing you know, they're hitting you with Soul Exchange Mobius. So very, very difficult deck to play against. Really powerful deck at the time. There were several copies in the top cut of the Shonen Jump in Washington. The next, I'm just going to point out that the Apprentice engine was somewhat popular because of the newly released Crystal Seer. It really didn't do much. Crystal Seer had ultimately ended up being really a total disappointment, but I will point out that at the beginning of the format, you probably would have run into at least one Monarch deck that tried to utilize the Apprentice engine. The deck that actually won the YCS, or rather the Shonen Jump in Washington, was a Perfect Circle deck run by Jonathan LaBounty. We're going to profile this deck eventually, but it's very similar to the deck that I ran in some of the videos recently with Monarchs, D-Heroes, and cards like Wing Blast. You could have run into more of the traditional sort of Treeborn Frog Monarch deck too, very common. Didn't necessarily need the Monarch engine with the Apprentice engine, but you could have seen it. I'll make it a separate deck for now. It really wouldn't have been popular, but I should credit Chris Perovic for running a DDT deck that actually still topped after a pretty significant restriction to a lot of cards in that deck. Another really popular deck at the time was Gadgets. There were a bunch of Gadget decks that topped. What's actually interesting is that the Gadgets themselves were limited to 2. The cards that you might not anticipate being overwhelmingly powerful, but they were actually limited to 2 across the board. Red, yellow, and green. You obviously would have expected a mirror match. You're already main decking a card like Widespread Ruin for it, so you could have absolutely run into the mirror match. There were a bunch of decks that were just a pile of good cards. They didn't really have a streamlined strategy. I'm talking about decks with a Warrior Toolbox, with cards like DD Assailant and Exiled Force. There were a bunch of decks with things like Hydrogeddon in it, so it wasn't a streamlined strategy in the same way that the Burn deck was or the DDT deck was, but this was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where, you know, if you wanted to run some Mystic Tomatoes and Don Zalugs and a couple Warriors and maybe a Hydrogeddon package, you probably still could and be relatively competitive. There were a couple decks in the top cut of this event that were just piles of decent cards all thrown together. So we'll acknowledge that with the DD Assailant and the Hydrogeddons. We'll move all of these cards off to the side and get into some of the side deck choices made by Team Super Friends. And we'll talk about whether or not they were overall good decisions. The first one is an interesting package. So every member of Super Friends ran a small return and bazoo package. I think this was really interesting. It often incorporated 2 returns from the side deck, a couple bazoos in the side deck, and then a copy or 2 of Magical Merchant. It made it so that in games 2 and 3, the deck had an interesting side strategy, and it would sometimes beat you out of nowhere. You know, you're playing this grindy game, and your opponent's setting Pyramid Turtles, and you don't really want to attack into them. You don't really want to give your opponent an opportunity to do much. And then all of a sudden, they use Bazoo, they get rid of a bunch of zombie monsters, and they return them. And the thing with return is, when you're bringing back Pyramid Turtles and Giant Rats, those are basically floater monsters if your opponent has a monster on board, so you can just crash them. And next thing you know, the return is actually a 2 or 3, a +2 or 3, because the monsters aren't going to get banished if you're crashing cards like Turtle. And what's actually interesting here is if you have one Turtle, you can crash it into a second Turtle, and then crash it into a third turtle. Honestly, you would do this a lot anyway, just to fuel your graveyard in game one. But then that might ultimately result in you having cards like a Zombie Master on the field or a Koki on the field. But what that has also done beyond upgrading your Pyramid Turtle is it's put 3 monsters in the graveyard now. And on the following turn, you can Bazoo and banish all 3 of the turtles. And now your return from the different dimension is unbelievably threatening, because on the next turn you could return, bring back all your turtles, crash again, and beat somebody out of nowhere. So this little return package, I think, was a really interesting side strategy that this deck could do. Other cards in the side deck. This deck side decked oftentimes a copy of Vampire Lord, which is pretty awesome. I think this card's really overrated in some of the older formats like Go Control, but you know what? If your opponent's playing gadgets and their deck has 3 Smashing, 3 Sakuratsu Armor, 3 Fissure, sure. Poseidon Vampire Lord, you can access it really easily through Pyramid Turtle. That's a pretty cool card. I'll give you credit there. Other cards you often could see, and it wasn't super popular, but I will note, if you're playing against the Comic Odyssey burn deck, the Skill Drain burn deck, this deck had 3 Solemns and 3 Dark Bribes, which made it, once they established a board, it was really hard to win, because you'd play MST, Dust Tornado, and they just Dark Bribe it, and they had more counter traps than you did spell and trap card destruction. Spiritualism was an interesting card that was popular at the time because it could bounce your opponent's Skill Drain, or let's say their Wave Motion Cannon that was about to beat you, and they could not respond with a counter trap based on Spiritualism's effect. So if I were to go back and play this format, I think Spiritualism's a really useful card to consider. Now, granted, some of the Comic Odyssey burn decks just sided into Monarchs anyway, so it kind of is a moot point. But let's say you were confident that that wasn't going to be the case, or that they were going to side back into the burn variant. Spiritualism was really good. This was a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and I commented on this in profiles from the previous format, that pulling the rug was super popular. We're looking at all these Monarch decks, we're looking at Perfect Circle, so we're definitely going to include cards like Pulling the Rug, and then definitely cards like Royal Decree. Does a decent job against burn decks, does a decent job against gadget decks, does a decent job against some of these just generically good decks with Hydrogeddons and a bunch of traps. So cards like Royal Decree were pretty popular as well. The last thing I want to do before ending the video is talk a little bit about the rulings at the time relative to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And why this deck was so much fun and so powerful. So at the time, if you had Zombie Master in your hand and Card of Safe Return, let's say on turn 1, let's just make it so that you had a crazy opening hand. You opened up with all 6 of these cards. This was obviously highly unlikely because you wouldn't likely open with multiple copies of Zombie Master like this, but for the sake of discussion, let's say you did. Today, this really wouldn't do anything, but at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you could actually play Card of Safe Return, play the Zombie Master, and even though you had nothing in the graveyard, you could ditch the Zombie Master to special summon Zombie Master, and then, of course, because a monster was revived from the graveyard, you could draw a card. So I'm going to shuffle my deck a little bit. Hopefully we draw a level 4 or lower zombie, but we'll see what we get. Heavy Storm, not the best, but not the worst either. We can now use the next Zombie Master to ditch it and draw another card. So another spell and trap card. So we have to stop there. But let's say we drew something like a Pyramid Turtle. Instead of the Heavy Storm, we could actually then keep going and then special summon the Pyramid Turtle off of the 3rd Zombie Master and then draw another card. You have to think back. This is 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh! And you have 4 monsters on the board, Zombie Masters that are threatening more revivals on the following turn, a floater on the board. I mean, the best thing your opponent can really do here is maybe Soul Exchange Ryza or Brain Control Ryza. That's powerful, don't get me wrong, but it's absolutely not game-breaking. Look at how many resources you have off of just 1 Card of Safe Return. And when the deck gets going and you have cards like Book of Life, and you have cards like Premature Burial, and you have cards like Call of the Haunted, maybe even multiple Card of Safe Returns, there were some times where you would have 6 cards in hand, 6 spell and trap cards, 6 monsters on the field, playing against an opponent who has access to maybe 5 or 6 cards. There was almost no deck at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that could compete with just how quickly this deck could accumulate resources, which made this deck really iconic and an incredibly fun deck at the time. But thank you for watching. This is a deck profile of the 2007 September format Zombie Card of Safe Return deck. Check back later for more variants of decks from this format, as we'll be profiling in the upcoming weeks decks like Perfect Circle, maybe even the Comic Odyssey burn deck, and a few others.